The answer is 62,000 miles. Yeah, that's a lot. That's probably more mileage than a lot of people have on their cars, college students excluded. That's our closest neighbor. That's 4.5 light years. The Milky Way galaxy is approximately 150,000 light years in diameter. It is absolutely huge. I did not bother doing the math on that because it would lose all tangibility at that point, which was the whole point of the demonstration to begin with. All right, so that is some sense of scale for you. Oh, I forgot to mention one thing, and that is the distance to the sun on this scale would be about a quarter mile. So that's not as impressive how you're figuring out this guitar. But it'd be about a quarter mile on this scale from us to the sun. All right, next slide. To illustrate this point farther and to wrap up the first part of this talk tonight, I want to show you two images. And these are my two favorite images of space that have ever been produced. So the first one is called the Hubble Deep Field. So the idea here is there are parts of the night sky where we don't detect any light. We don't see any stars, any galaxies, any planets. We don't really see anything. And so back about 20 years ago, 25 years ago, there was an idea from one of the scientists working with Hubble who suggested that we pick one of these spots in the sky, one of these dark spots, and we stare at it with Hubble for a really long time. And as you look at something with a telescope, the longer you look, the more light the telescope receives, the fainter an object you can detect, essentially. And so the idea was, let's just take Hubble, have it stare at one portion of these dark spots in the sky, see what we get back. And they didn't think they were going to get, some people didn't think they were going to get anything back at all. Some people didn't know what to expect. What they ended up getting back has now been called the Hubble Deep Field. And what you're seeing here, with the exception of pointy objects, so like this guy here, there are a few more. But every other speck of light in this image, ranging from this guy, the big ones you can clearly see, to all the super tiny ones, every other speck of light is a galaxy. There's not a planet, there's not a moon, not a star, those are entire galaxies. Every one of these, even the ones that are furthest away and look like barely blips in this picture, are galaxies that are in all likelihood at least as large as the Milky Way, if not several times larger. The Milky Way contains about 400 billion stars. Our nearest galactic neighbor, Andromeda, contains 1 trillion stars. So just for funsies, let's say that all of these galaxies contain an average of 3/4 of 1 trillion stars. If you're trying to count the number of points of light in this image, I will save you time. It is 3,000, or just about. You have 3,000 galaxies in this image, every one of them containing, let's say, average 3/4 of 1 trillion stars. The farthest galaxies in this image are a distance of 12 billion light years away, meaning the light leaving the farthest points of light in this image left those galaxies 12 billion years ago. Keep in mind, the universe began 13.8 billion years ago. We have now repeated this numerous times, most recently with James Webb, and you've probably seen that one at least, and they're all very impressive, but the original is my favorite. Now you might be thinking to yourself, well, that's crazy, but this is the sky, right? The sky's huge. So this must be, I don't know, 40% of the sky that we're looking at, or 4%, or 1%. And you would all be drastically overestimating the total portion of sky this image represents. This portion of sky is 1/22 millionth of the total sky. As in, there are 20, broke the sky up into even numbers, or even parts. There are 22 million of these. And if we removed all the stuff in the foreground, all the stars, all the planets, all the bright stuff would get in the way of seeing this, this is what we would see in all 22 million parts. Do the math. 22 million times 3,000, that's a lot. All of which containing 3/4 of 1 trillion stars. Insane. Yes?
So how do we know they're not just a singular star? I mean, this is not an astrophysicist.
Sure. Stars are not bright enough for us to detect them at that distance.
Gotcha.
We can detect the distance, and then we know, based on the distance we're getting, there are no stars that would possibly be able to shine that bright in order for us to see. All right, Hubble Deep Field. Next image. Yeah, some of you may recognize this image. If you do, don't spoil it. And the rest of you may think this looks vaguely familiar, and the reason for that is because you've actually been staring at this picture all night. It is the background of every one of my slides that I've used so far. Now, this image comes our way of the Voyager spacecraft, which was one space probe. It and its twin, Voyager 2, were sent out in the 70s to study the solar system objects, and then they were essentially flung out of the solar system to continue on forever and ever. If you have heard of the golden record and the diagram of man that we put on the satellite and flung out, that is the Voyager spacecraft. Now, when Voyager 2 was studying Pluto, which is not a planet, hate to break it to you, but it is on the outside of our solar system. It's the last object of note in our solar system. We asked Voyager, we were going to fling it out into interstellar space. But before we did that, we asked it to turn around and to take an image of the solar system from the vantage point of around the orbit of Pluto. So it did that. And what came through was this image. This is actually Carl Sagan's idea, for those of you who recognize that name. And the story goes is that when this picture came through at NASA, they were wiping the dust off the image from the printer. And they noticed that they couldn't get one speck of dust off. Next slide. So I'll go ahead and zoom in for you if you can't see it. What you're looking at here are sunbeams refracting in the image. And there's this pale blue dot here in the center. I think all of you have probably figured this out by now. That's the planet Earth as viewed from Pluto, or thereabouts. You will notice that we look like a speck of dust, and that we've looked so much like a speck of dust that we fooled several NASA scientists for several minutes as they watched furiously at this speck of dust before realizing they could not get it off the image. This image is called the pale blue dot. And if you want, Carl Sagan has a great quote summarizing kind of the human condition in relation to this image, and it's great. But the idea here is this image, I love it for many reasons, but one of them is that it humbles me greatly. Because, as Sagan put it, we are simply a speck of dust floating through a sun, or suspended in the sun, floating around the sun. Our sun is huge, but not really. Our solar system is huge, but not really. Our galaxy is huge, but not really, because we're all in successive islands of an ocean of just vastness. And if we go back to the Hubble field real quick, and ultimately, the reason why I believe in God is because something made this, and he put you on the pale blue dot. And everything that happened in between, and every other thing that we study, and every other thing that we analyze to try and look for answers about our existence, ultimately boils down to a God of infinite size, providing infinite detail in creation. And ultimately, that is why I believe science is the greatest testament to God's existence that exists. That concludes our first portion of the night. Let's take a short break to grab cookies and coffee, go to the restroom if we need it. We'll reconvene in about 10 minutes for Q&A. Alright, so we're going to get started. We're going to start with the questions that were asked via the QR code first, and then we'll open up some live Q&A in a minute. So let's go ahead and go to the first question, which is there. Alright, so this is a lighthearted question to get us started. Is it possible for there to be more concentration on another planet? So, are there aliens? Well, there are two perspectives. I'll give you the faith perspective and the science perspective. The science perspective is really simple. Yes, the universe, as we just went through, is simply too large for there to not be life on another planet. Now, depending on who you ask, will depend on what percentage of chance you get for life on another planet. Some people are wildly optimistic about that. Others are much more conservative. And again, we have to ask the degree. By life on another planet, are you talking little green people we can talk to? Are you talking deer? Are you talking single microbial life? What are we talking about here? All of which I think probably exist elsewhere in the universe. It's just a matter of being able to contact them in any way, which I personally believe will never happen due to simply the impossible scale of the universe. The faith perspective, at least for me, and I've had people who very, very strongly disagree with me on this, so feel free to voice your displeasure if you want. But to me, if we claim God to be a God of infinite image, an infinite God in all respects, then to me it would be absolutely amazing to find out after death that Earth is not only part of the kingdom of heaven, or not the kingdom of heaven, but is a part of the kingdom of heaven. And so there could be intelligent beings all over the universe that have no chance of ever contacting each other, but who all find themselves worshiping the same God. And I think that's an awesome idea. I also honestly don't think the answer to this question impacts my faith at all. You could tell me we're alone, and I think that's great, because that means we really are unique, and that means we are truly a jewel of God's creation, and that's awesome. And if we're not alone, then I'm a physicist. Aliens would be the greatest day of my life. So I'm not concerned really either way, but I'm willing to hear other opinions on that. Next question. Yeah?
Are there other stars as like stable as the sun that you know of?
Yes, yes. So there are, again, just due to the sheer scale of the universe, there are lots and lots and lots of stars that are like our sun, that could potentially have life. But our sun is remarkably boring, which is great for us. The other thing with life on another planet to consider is we are only familiar with carbon-based life. And so when we think of life on another planet, we naturally assume it will be carbon-based. That may not be true everywhere. And so that's a whole other avenue for things to happen.
Like
All right.
Transformers.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. Yes.
Sorry.
Yeah. Exactly. All right. Are you familiar with God and gas theory? And if so, how do you reconcile that with your faith? So I promised we talked about this earlier. This is probably one of the most frequent criticisms of people of faith when having this conversation with people who are not. And that is, my favorite way to put this is actually Neil deGrasse Tyson, who I'm sure you're all familiar with, has defined the God of the gaps as if, as a person of faith, you put your God in an ever-receding pocket of scientific ignorance, then you don't worship God. You worship the scientific ignorance. And essentially what that means is if you look at something, so like I mentioned earlier, scientific gaps in the fossil record, and go, then those things don't exist, so God, and then next year they find all those fossils, you look like an idiot. Because you have ascribed scientific ignorance as your God. And so you will notice tonight that I have not pointed to things that we do not scientifically understand as proof of God's intervention or as proof of God's existence. I find proof of God's existence in the detailed universe, the things we do know. And there's a real tendency in Christian apologetics to look at things we don't know and immediately attribute them to God, and then immediately have to backtrack 5 years later when we find scientific answers to those things that we solely attributed to the supernatural. So yes, this is absolutely something. This is also why I would not call myself a Christian apologist, because this is, quite frankly, too frequent behavior from Christian apologists for me to be comfortable being grouped in with those. All right. This is Q&A, so if you all thoughts, feel free. But yeah. This is similar to the last question. What role do you see confirmation bias having in your faith? It's a little bit more general. But yeah, this is something that I try to avoid. And again, I think part of this comes from my training as a scientist. We're constantly trying to seek objective truth, whatever that may be, and to ignore our biases at the door. I am currently working in a lab that I had no experience and no exposure to the topic before I started in the lab. And what I found very quickly was a huge advantage for me, because I had no expectation of what should happen at all. I was working basically blind. And what that allowed me to do was go, I have no idea what should happen, so I'm going to take notes on everything that does happen. And that eventually allowed me, once I figured out what should be happening, to go back through my notes and figure out, okay, these things happened, these things didn't, I need to do this, I need to do that, shouldn't do that. Those sorts of things. We want to avoid confirmation bias as much as possible, which is why I would also encourage all of you with caution, approach all sides of this conversation. I actually tend to read and engage more with the atheist agnostic view on this topic than I do with the Christian apologist view on this topic, because to me, the best testament to my faith is the ability to refute arguments against it. Now, that is absolutely something that you need to approach with caution, especially if you're someone who is young in your faith. That is certainly be an avenue for bad times, yes.
Can you explain what confirmation bias is?
Yes, seeking the answers you want when they don't actually exist. So, for example, there are people, we discussed earlier, who are scientists who will try and reconcile 6 days of creation with relativity. There is a very accomplished, actually Nobel Prize nominated, not won, but nominated, which is still a huge accomplishment, physicist in Israel, cosmologist. He's Jewish, and he's written several books on Christian apologetics. Now, one of his claims is that he can reconcile 7 days of creation with relativity, which is Einstein's idea and scientific fact that time passes differently at high speeds. And so since the universe is expanding at very high speeds, that you can reconcile 13.8 billion years with 7 days of creation. And I am not aware of any theologian or scientist who has looked at his work for more than 5 minutes and not laughed at it. But that has been his method of reconciliation, and to me that is a huge source of confirmation bias. Next question. Do you think shortening claims require extraordinary evidence? Yes, I do. So if you claim that the universe is expanding, for example, which was only discovered in the last 100 years, that required extraordinary evidence, because that was a claim that was completely counterintuitive at the time. And it was something that the proponents of that idea had to go through and rigorously, scientifically prove beyond a shadow of a doubt with mountains of evidence. However, there are things that I believe that we cannot prove. Build a telescope, look for heaven, you won't find it. I don't care how strong the telescope is, I don't care where you look, you will never find it. Part of being a Christian and dealing with this topic is acknowledging that Christianity in general is a belief in somewhat in the supernatural, and things that you will not whatever. God does light in causality. You won't find heaven with a telescope. I don't know where hell is, and I don't really care. It's not the place I want to be. That's where it is. The last place you want to be. There are things about our faith that we should acknowledge that we will not ever be able to give factual answers to. And that can be uncomfortable, especially for people like myself who deal in fact with theory all the time, but that is the truth of the matter. Next question. All right, so this is essentially what I talked about earlier. I'm actually going to go over this question because I've already answered it, but this is the question about Christian apologetics seeking objective truth or looking for confirmation bias. I think I've addressed this already pretty thoroughly. I don't really have much to add about that. The short answer is yes, God the Gap theory is intellectually dishonest and is easily disprovable. Next question. Do you think humanity will ever colonize Mars or another planet? If so, how do you think that may impact Christianity? I like this question. This is a fun question. No, I don't think it will impact Christianity whatsoever. I also don't think we'll ever colonize Mars. I want to, don't get me wrong, I absolutely want to. We will go to Mars, hopefully within the next 2 decades. There are no formal plans to go to Mars, but we are returning to the moon in 6 years with the Artemis 3 mission, which will land the first woman and the first person of color on the moon as well. And then the goal of those missions, the Artemis, is to build a lunar outpost, essentially, to help launch to Mars. And that is NASA's current plan, and they're working in conjunction with SpaceX and other private space companies and contractors to work to that goal. Just actually this week, NASA locked 4 astronauts inside a 1,500 square foot enclosure inside a big building, essentially, that simulates what living on Mars would be like for a year. They're staying in a 1,500 square foot space with 3 other people for a year. If I were one of those people, the 3 others would be dead before the end of the second day.